Hi, welcome in day 3 Java Basic course. In day 3, we're going to discuss what are exceptions and then we're going to have a demo on the exceptions. So let's get started. An exception or exceptional event is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. When an exception occurs, the normal flow of the program is disrupted and the program or application terminates abnormally, which is not recommended. Therefore, these exceptions are to be handled. An exception can occur for many different reasons. For example, a user has entered an invalid data, a file that needs to be opened cannot be found, a network connection has been lost in the middle of communication, or the JVM has run out of memory, or the SQL exceptions occurred when you're trying to access the database, or some other kind of exceptions can be occurred. So let's see how many types of exceptions are, how we handle them, and how we catch them. So the first category of exception is called checked exceptions. A checked exception is an exception that is checked or notified by the compiler at compilation time. These are also called as compile time exceptions. These exceptions cannot simply be ignored. The programmer or the developer should take care of or handle these exceptions. So the checked exceptions are those that need to be handled or that need to be taken care during the program execution. So that's the developer's job, the person who is writing a code which can uh, have kind of checked exceptions that need to be handled by the developer. So the examples of exceptions which are come under checked exceptions are IO exceptions, which is a kind of when you are trying to open files or doing some IO operations. These kind of exceptions can occur. Then file not found exceptions, parse exceptions, class not found exceptions. Then you have no such method exception, no such field exception. Interrupted exceptions can happen during the when you have threadings kind of things. We will learn later what the threads are and how these exceptions can occur. We see all the exceptions when we do the examples. We see like how the IO exceptions are happening, how we prevent them, how we block them, and how we handle them. Other kind of common exceptions are unchecked exceptions. And unchecked exceptions is an exception that occurs at the time of execution. So they are not a compile time exception, they are runtime exceptions. So when you run your program, when you compile it, you won't see any errors coming from the compiler because they are not compile time error, but they will be raised during the runtime of the program. So these include programming bugs such as logic errors, or improper use of an API. Runtime exceptions are ignored at the time of the compilation. So for example, you have null pointer exception. So null pointer will only occur when that null object or the null instance will try to trigger it. So that exception will only occur at that time. So that cannot be catch at compile time. So that's called a runtime exception. Then we have like array index out of bound exceptions. We have seen this when we were studying arrays, that how array index out of bound exceptions happened. Then class cast exception, null pointer exception, assertion errors, stack overflow error, no class definition found error. So these kind of exceptions are called unchecked exceptions. And as a developer or programmer, we don't need to explicitly handle that exceptions. The JVM will automatically throw the exception when that exception will occur. Let's see the hierarchy of exceptions, like how the exceptions are created within JVM framework. So as we know, the main object or main class is object class, and then underneath there is a class called throwable, which extends object class. We have not studied yet what the extends are, but extends simply means that the throwable is having a characteristics and the methods of object class. So it's like kind of a child of an object class. And then there are two further classes, errors and exceptions. So errors and exception also extends throwable class. That means the error is a child of throwable and exceptions class is a child of throwable. So they inherit all the properties and the methods which are defined in throwable and in object class. In exceptions, we can have two further categories called runtime exceptions. right? And the other are other exceptions. That other exceptions are actually the checked exceptions that need to be handled by the developer, and the runtime exceptions that the JVM will automatically handle it, so we don't need to worry much about the runtime exceptions. So how we catch the exceptions, right? A method catches an exception using a combination of a try and catch keywords. A try catch block is placed around the code that might generate an exception. Right? So we are not 100% sure that it will generate exception, but we thought that it might generate an exception. So we try to catch it within that block. So the syntax is, we say try, the curly brackets, and inside that we specify the code which might throw an exception, and then we try to catch that with the catch keyword, and inside that keyword we define the name of the exception which can be happen. It can be null point exception in, or kind of like SQL exceptions or IO exceptions. So we need to define exception name here. Even it's just the instance name for that exception, so we can use that name by logging that error within the catch block. So we have also seen the keyword called finally, and they are used inside some kind of catching it. So the finally blocks follows a try block or a catch block. A finally block of a code always executes irrespective of the occurrence of an exception. So whether the exception occurs or not, the finally block will always be run. And the purpose of the final block is to clean up things, right? So using a finally block allows you to run any cleanup type statement. For example, you open the file, exceptions occur, and then the file remain open, right? That's not a good thing. We don't want to waste our resources. So we need to close that file. So within a finally block, we can close our file. So you initiated a connection with the JDBC, right? Any exceptions occur, SQL exception occurred, and that throwing an exception. After that, the JDBC connection is still open, and we don't want to keep it open because that's a security risk, right? So we need to close that connection. We can do it within a finally block because we know whatever happened, either is in a try or in a catch block, the finally block will always run. So the syntax says we define the try block. Within a try block, we put a code which can throw an exception. Then we try to catch exceptions, right? We can have a multiple blocks of exceptions. So you might have in a try three kind of exceptions can be happen. IO exceptions, file not found exceptions, SQL exception, right? For example, so you need to catch one by one here. And the rule is in order to catch, you need to specify the youngest child here, right? And then the parent at the bottom. For example, the class is inheriting from exception class, right? So you cannot specify here just exception, right? Because that's the parent class. Because if it's a parent class, it will catch all the exceptions within that class, and then you will never know it is file not found exception or a SQL exception kind of things. So you need to specify the child first and then the parent after that. So the second catch will be a parent, the first catch block will be a child. And then we have a finally keyword. So that's finally, which we know this will always run regardless the exception happening or not. And then the finally blocks always executes. We try to clean up things, close the resources and the connections. So this helps us to create a system where we have a security and the resources are intact. There's also try with resource block came with Java 7. So also referred as automatic resource management is a new exception handling mechanism that was introduced in Java 7, which automatically close the resources used within the try catch block. So you don't need to explicitly define finally. Whatever you try to execute within your try with the resource, if any exception will occur, it will try to close that thing what you try to open it or try to close the connections. To use this statement, you simply need to declare a required resources within a parenthesis, and the create resources will be closed automatically at the end of the block. So the syntax is in try you specify what you're trying to to close it when something exception occurs. So we say the file reader, new file reader. So if any file exceptions occurred, file not found exception occur, or file not found exception occurred, um, uh, these exceptions will be cached, and then it will automatically close that resource. So the resource will not be open anymore. It means the resources will be available to use further. We also have a user defined exceptions. So let's say you don't want any JVM exceptions occur, either in on a checked or unchecked, and you want to define your own exception. For example, you say I'm trying to call some endpoints, REST endpoints. If something happened, I need to throw my exception, which explains the users what happened at the REST endpoint level, rather than you getting 404 not found or some other exception. You want to some meaningful exceptions, and that for the meaningful exception you define your own exceptions, right? Let's see how we define our exceptions. So you can create your own exceptions in Java. All exception must be a child of a throwable. If you want to write a checked exception that is automatically enforced by the handle or declare rule, you need to extend the exception class. If you want to write runtime exception, you need to extend the runtime exception class. So the way we create exceptions, user defined exceptions are: we define a class, and the class name can be any class name, the exception you want it to be triggered. Then you say extend. So this means I'm going to extend from exception class, right? Exception will be the parent class, so any properties and the method defines within exception class will automatically come into my exception class. Let's see what is throw and throws keyword. So throw keyword is used to explicitly throw an exception. For example, you are trying to do something and you know something can be went wrong. Instead of relying on the JVM to throw an exception, you said I want to throw an exception. For example, you say if the user put information, for example, the wrong email, right, and you for for the perspective for the string, the email is fine, but you have specified some rule for the email, right? And if that rules are not met, you want to throw an exception. The JVM will not know that if the string is right or wrong. You need to specify explicitly out of that JVM bounds, and you need to specify that, okay, if this kind of input occurred within a system, I feel that input is an error because my program will not execute further. So I want to throw an exception, right? So you throw exception just by seeing the code or just by looking at the input the user provided you, right? So with the throw keyword, we explicitly defining that throw, so throw is a keyword. The throw new exception and then the message. This exception can be a user defined exception, right? It can be user defined exception, or it can be any JVM exception as well. Throws keyword. So this is throw. The throws. So the throw is we explicitly throw an exception. The throws exception, which is a little different, is a keyword used in a method signature to indicate that the method throw an exception, and caller of that method either handle that exception or define, again it define throws that any other method which call that method will handle that exception. So let's see an example. So there is a method called method 1. So this is method 1, and inside that method there is a chance that method can throw an exception, and the method is not handling that exception within its body because it's leaving to the end user that how he want to handle that exception and what message he want to show when that exception occurs. So he said my method can throw some kind of exception and I'm not handling it, so if you're calling me, then you need to handle it. So say throws some exception. It can be an exception, so just some exception is just the dummy name. So it said I throw an exception if you call me, handle it. So the method 2 which need to call method 1 here. Okay, so when I try to call that method, you see the compiler will start giving an error that you need to handle that exception because you're calling a method which said I throw exception. So there one way is you say I can handle it by providing a try catch block. We have seen it earlier. So we can handle that exception within try catch block, and in a catch we say, okay, I'm going to catch exception which is going to be thrown by the method 1, right? This is a one way of doing it. Another way is doing the method 2, calling that method 1, right? But it's not handling that exception here. And what it's saying again, okay, I am calling a method, which method I know throws exception. I'm not going to handle that exception. So let's the JVM handle it, or let's another caller application handle that exception. So it just say it throws an exception, right? So there are two ways of handling it. Either you say I'm going to handle it myself to try and catch block, or you say I'm going to dedicate it to the other end users to catch that exception or handle that exception. So let's start a demo and see how these things actually work within a code. So I've created one main class. It has a method, static method, void main, which we're actually calling the application. And then I've defined one method which is a divide method. It is taking two variables as a parameter, integer a and integer b, and then it is getting one result integer, and then dividing a with b and returning a result back to the user. So here we're calling that method and then printing the result whatever it is coming back, which will be of course integer. So let's run this one. When I run this, so it throw an exception. Let me increase that one. So exception in a thread main, which is called arithmetic exception, and this exception is happening because we are dividing a number with 0, right? So the program the has been terminated with some exception, and we couldn't find out where this exception happened and how we can prevent this to happen. And then rather than throwing an exception, if we want to continue the program flow or explain the user what he need to change, or rather than just throwing an exception. So this is a plain way of handling exceptions. So let's say this at this point with the result a divisible by b, which is 10 divided by 0, can throw an exception if the user provide input b. So there are two ways. First, we can check if int is b, and the int b is equal to 0, then we not proceed with this statement, and we just say that just return 0 or throw some other kind of exception that say the b is not a valid number or something like that. But they're mostly the cases where we cannot only have the parameter, but we do the processing within the method, and then from that processing something went wrong, right? So this is just a very simple and plain example. We can prevent this with putting an if condition, and then this block will not be executed. But let's see how we handle exceptions, right? So after this line I'm going to put try block. So just try. So I'm going to try this statement, right? And then I'm going to have a catch, and that catch need to be have exception, arithmetic exception. So I copy that one, I paste it here, and give an instance name just an e. Okay, so what I have done, I've specified the try block. Within a try block, I'm testing the operation of my method, and then if the exception is happening, I'm catching that exception. And then here I can uh, do like log that exception, log the message, or return the message to the console. So let's save this and see how this works. Now you see with the same input, so 10 divisible by 0, it is not throwing an exception. Actually, it is returning a result because we specify result is equal to 0, right? So it is returning that result, but when it comes to the try block, it try to do division here, 10 divisible by 0, and then exception occurs, so it's throw an exception, but the program continues and it will give you an return which is a 0. So this is, by this way we can handle our exception and we can continue the program flow. We can log that errors into some logging system, and then the later user can find out, okay, what happened wrong, why he's getting a 0 input. So through logging he can understand why the method is returning 0, why the output is wrong, because he is expecting something else and output is wrong. So he can go to the logging and he can check the logging there. So this by this mechanism we can handle exception very easily. Now let's assume you're inside your try block, you have some other operations happening, for example some file opening exception, right? And then you do have some kind of exceptions. For example, you're trying to do some SQL, right? Trying to connect with the JDBC, so some SQL things happening, some SQL code is here, right? So at this point you're only catching one exception, which is arithmetic exception, which can be occurred due to this line number 12 when it will run. But what about line number 13 and line number 14, right? So what we can do, we can specify more catches here, right? So say catch file not found exception. Yeah, we need to import that class. And the similar way we can specify the SQL exceptions kind of thing. So we can catch multiple exceptions by doing, just by catching into the different blocks. But one thing we need to memorize that the catch exceptions are from child to parent. So you cannot specify here like exception. So you can say exception and then you will say arithmetic exception, right? So this is not allowed because you specify parent first and the child later on. So that's wrong, right? So now we need to see how the finally works. So as we mentioned in our theory session that we can specify try catch, and then at the end we can specify finally block, and finally is normally used to clean up the resources which always run regardless the exception happening or not. So in the first case, we are calling that divide method with two parameters 10 and 0. So when 10 is divisible by 0, it throw arithmetic exception, right? So we need to see that is this finally executing or not when the exception is happening, right? So we know the exception will happen because we're dividing it by 0 forcefully. So let's run that one. Yeah. So you see the exception happened. I couldn't divide, and then it is returning 0 because we defined result is equal to 0. Uh, and then it is also printing I am in a finally block. This means this block has been executed. So right. So let's change the input. So I'm going to change that input to 10 10. At this point I know exception will not occurred because 10 divisible by 10 gives an answer 1. So I'm just going to save it, run it, and now the answer is 1, but also going into a finally block. So it comes to try block, it try to do the divisible operation here, it divided, got a result is equal to 1, right? And then catch is not occurred because there is no exception at line number 12. So it went straight into the finally block because finally blocks always execute regardless exception or not. So if let's say you have some resources to open here, file open or SQL connection open or any JDBC connection open, or you're calling any REST APIs, and then you need to close that connections, right? So you can close that connections or close the threads within a final block, so the resource will be available for other programs or other program units to run, and then you return the result. So it is going into a finally block and printing whatever we write inside the finally block to print on. Now we see how throw and throws keyword works. So I've changed my divide method little bit, and inside the try block I'm saying if the b is equal to 0, then throw a new exception, right? So this is a throw keyword which I'm using to explicitly throw an exception, and the message I'm printing is the value of denominator cannot be 0. And because I'm throwing it, so I need to catch this exception here as well, and I'm catching that exception and printing the print stack trace actually print whatever we getting inside that e, right? And then after that the finally block will be run, right? So this is the way we throw exceptions, right? We can throw any kind of exception. You can be user defined exceptions, which we'll see later how we create a user defined exceptions and how we can throw that exceptions. So let's run this program and see the output. Okay, so let me maximize this. Yeah. So you see the java.lang.exception, the value of denominator cannot be 0. So that's the error message which we want to be printed when that exception is thrown. And because the value of b was 0, so the exception has been thrown, and then after that finally block executed, and then the value 0 is returned, right? If I changed this divide to 10, save that, run it, and now that exception is not thrown because when it reached to this if block, that condition is false, so it's not went inside line number 13, and this part is not executed, so the exception is not thrown. So this is the way we specify a throw keyword. But let's assume that we don't want to catch that exception here, right? We want a user to catch that exception, and we don't want to specify this. So if I remove this part, you see the error is shown here, and the error is saying add throws declaration, add catch close to surrounding try catch block, or surrounding with the try catch block. So I'm going to add the first option, add throws declaration. And add throws declaration means within my method signature, I'm going to say my method will throw some kind of exception, right? So the method who is calling that method that need to handle it. So if you go back to the call where we met making that call to the method, you see the error is coming here. And what the error is saying here, that error is saying that either you throw a declaration, so throws declaration need to be added here with the method signature, or you need to handle it. So handle it with the try catch block. So there are always two mechanisms. Either you handle it, or you say I'm not going to handle it, but I'm going to throwing it explicitly by just defining into your method signature. So let's go with the second option. So I say surround with try catch block. When I click on this one, it will the IDE will automatically do the try catch block, and then it knows the method is throwing exception. It will be catching with an exception and then printing it that way. So let's save that, run it. We're not expecting any exception because the value is 10. Let's change it to 0 and we save it, and you see, so the finally block being executed, and then after that it went to this try catch block, and then inside that catch block this error message is say the value of denominator cannot be 0, which has been generated through this print stack trace, and the value is actually coming from this exception, right? I hope that makes clear what is the difference between throw and throws. Now we see how we can create a custom exception. I've created one class. The class name is my exception. It can be any name, whatever you like. That class is extending exception class. So let's see what we have inside that exception class. We need to attach a source. I'll show you later what is inside that class. What we need to do, we need to create one constructor for that class. So that's my exception. That's the constructor, which take one parameter string, and then it is calling super. So the super is a constructor of this class. So what I'm saying, when the constructor has been called with a string value, I need to call a super constructor, which is super means a constructor of exception class, and then I need to pass that error message, right? So that's all I'm doing it into that custom exception. We can do many things within it, but just for the beginning, I want to demonstrate like how we can create my exception and then how we can throw that exception when we want it. So that's my exception class. So inside my method, rather than throwing exception, I'm going to say I'm going to throw my exception, right? So I'm throwing my exception, and then I say my method throws exception. If I say exception, that's fine because exception is a parent of my exception, so we don't see any error here, but we need to be specify it in a way that we are very sure that it will be my exception and not any other kind of exception. So I say it throws my exception. So I saved it, and then I'm catching exception. I'm not seeing any error, right? Because my exception is a parent. Exception is a parent class of my exception, so there is no issue here because I can catch the parent. But if I have a parent throwing exception, I cannot only specify the child. I need to specify the parent as well. So this works fine, but to be sure, I'm going to change it to my exception. Right? I'm going to save it now. So I run it. So you'll see now exception is thrown, and this time exception is not exception class, but this is my exception class, and the value of denominator cannot be 0. So that message is picked up from here, and that's thrown when the method is called and been caught into this print stack trace. Right? So let me repeat. So in order to create customized exception, we need to create a class. That's the normal standard class, and we extend it from the parent class. So in our case, the parent class is exception. So I'm extending from the parent class, and then I'm calling a super constructor. So that super is a constructor of exception class. So that's all done. The customized exception class is ready. Now where I need to throw that exception, I will come to that class and I say throw the instance of my exception. That will be the anonymous instance of my exception class with string value, the message which I want to print it, and then I will say my class is throwing my method is throwing an exception. So if anyone calling that, then need to handle that. So here we see in the main we calling that method, and this main method is calling that divide method. It means that method need to handle that exception. So we're handling that exception, and we say I'm handling catching that exception with the my exception, and then throwing an error message back to the user. I hope that makes clear to you. And with the demo, we have reached end of day 3. So thank you very much for watching and see you in the next lesson. Till then, bye.